Lake Hindmarsh all the way through to the Wyperfeld Plain. You have so many different little lakes as part of that system, the teardrop lakes. Most of those relate back to the giant kangaroo story. The version that I know, there are two famous brothers. They're pretty talented hunters and warriors and magic men, I suppose you could call them. They had an uncle who went out hunting and came across this giant kangaroo that was hopping along. The giant kangaroo obviously didn't want to get captured, so it put on a bit of a spurt to get away from the uncle. Wherever he stopped and grazed, he'd create a fairly large depression which would become a lake. Where the kangaroo hopped along, he made depressions in the ground which became water holes, which eventually joined up to create the Wimmera River. So most of the lakes within the system could have been created by the giant kangaroo. The kangaroo got away from the hunter because the hunter himself became hunted by a giant spider. The giant spider actually wanted to get the kangaroo, but doing it scared him away, and therefore he thought, well, I'm going to get that guy instead. When the Brand brothers, the two famous brothers, found out that their uncle was killed by the spider, they tracked him all the way up and eventually came across him, and when they fought him, they knocked his head off, and his head, when it got knocked off, rolled around, creating the depression which is now Lake Wonga. So Lake Wonga is probably a particular place amongst the lakes where the spider and the two brothers had a hand in making. That's basically the story of how the river and the lakes system came to be.
Enlightening thing for me has been my interest in the Mallee and the Mallee farmers and the stories of settlement of that area. It's terribly marginal country and really probably should never have been settled, that marginal country. The courage of these Mallee settlers and the women up there in those dreadful conditions in summer with hardly any water and so on. And I've got the greatest admiration for the Mallee farmers. Huge survival stories. One of the amazing things that I came across, and no one believes this who knows anything about births, was the story of Jane Cameron giving birth to twins at Wonga Station. That's where the campground is now. The Camerons had that area and they were there isolated from anywhere else, and she gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. And the story is that those twins were delivered by caesarean by her husband. It may just be true.
In a sense, the early history, what the pioneers did to try and make a living off the country, just in the process of clearing the land, they would build fences, which were marvellous constructions. The ways they had of raising water through a whim, which, a horse-drawn whim, a horse goes around, and as well as the natural values, there was also that human endeavour, which was absolutely extraordinary. And I mean, the story of the mail run.
So here's this kid who started at Dimboola and would come through from Dimboola to Rainbow and then up here to Pine Plains and then go cross country to Cow Plains, which is now on the Mallee Highway, on horseback, bringing the mail by himself at 14. Could you just imagine us doing something like that today? Or imagine how his mother felt. There'd be floods or heavy rain where he'd have to swim through the Wimmera River and, hold the mail up above his head and drag the horse across and finally get to the other side. Just the isolation.
That is rough country, and it's a long way. But they were tough people. It was frontier. Yeah, it was the edge of civilisation.
During the Depression and the droughts of the 1930s, they had to walk off the land. The channels that brought them water blocked up. They couldn't get water. They couldn't sell whatever they couldn't grow anything. They had nothing to sell except mallee roots, and they walked off their farms. And a number of those farms are now part of the park. In those days, the Mallee area was regarded as absolutely useless. And there's one politician who's going on record saying, well, it may as well be a national park, it's no good for anything else.
It was regarded very much as wasteland, but it's very good birdland. Of course, having that sort of internal lakelands made it very special, particularly if you got wet years.
A fellow called Archie Campbell went up there, and then Arthur Mattingly, who was another keen birdo, went up, and he got the idea of reserving part of this area as a national park. They were amazed at the profusion of the birds. What you've got there is you've got the creek system and the river red gums and the cypress pines, and then you've got the mallee. So you've got a nice diversity of habitat.
You've got floodplains and you've got sand dunes, you've got heath plains, you've got mallee flats. So anywhere where there's a variety of habitats, you get a variety of species.
National parks were only just starting, of course, because they'd started in America, and New South Wales had Royal National Park, and I suppose there was a bit of interstate, I don't know, but probably an element of interstate rivalry came into it. Mattingly photographed birds and he wrote articles about it for the newspapers and for the Field Naturalist magazine, and he got the idea of reserving part of this area as a national park. He was supported by Sir James Barrett and the National Parks Association. This is in the early 1900s, and one of the parks they pressed for was a park at Wyperfeld in the Wonga Lake area. That's where it began. You've got to say it's the birds and the field naturalists.
When it started, it was a very small area. The bit that was originally reserved as a national park was just the little bit that was on the flats. All the rest has been added subsequently.
Although it was called Reservation for National Park purposes, there was really no management of it at all. 1922, a committee of management was established, and at that stage you did have oversight by people who were interested.
Barrett had developed a huge interest in Wyperfeld. He was the chairman of a committee of management that managed the park, and he pressed for extensions. Barrett had good contacts with many people.
Reading the minutes of the committee, there's no doubt that James Barrett was the dominant thing. It says the chairman suggested that, passed unanimously. The chairman recommended that, agreed. He was Wyperfeld. Now the committees of management got no money from the government. They were expected to raise their own money to manage the park. And to do that, they did three things here. They sold firewood. They had grazing income from the O'Sullivans and then from the Campbell brothers, and they gave a local beekeeper the rights to have beehives.
O'Sullivans have been involved really right from the word go with our great-grandfather. You know, in the early days, being there as a friend and a guide to Barrett and Mattingly, and took them on all their initial surveys and so on. And then the families had the butcher shop in Rainbow, and they needed land whereby they could raise their stock, which they did on the park, and then took on the lease of Pine Plains, and that was back in 1914. And of course, we've been here ever since.
The committee used to meet in Melbourne, but also about once a year they'd come up here and meet in Wonga Hut when Wonga Hut was built. They built Wonga Hut, and they met in Wonga Hut. And they didn't get paid, the members of the Committee of Management. It was purely honorary. So they had to get themselves up to Wyperfeld, and you know, back in 1930s, that was no mean feat.
So it was really in about 1958 that management, in the sense that we know national parks now, started to become a reality. That led to the appointment of the first ranger, and so at last we had somebody with authority on site, and that was Rudd Campbell. He was employed as a part-time ranger only, but nevertheless it was good to have somebody there. Previous to that, there had been what you might call caretakers, of which the graziers were the main ones, and in reality they had no authority as such. It was a very strong committee of management. Quite a few of them were from Melbourne because they were naturalists who took a great interest in the park.
We had very few parks in Victoria then, in 1959, perhaps 10, and Wyperfeld was the biggest by a long way, and the second biggest was Wilson Promontory, and then we had Mount Buffalo, maybe 6 or 7 other smaller parks, and a total area of 200,000 hectares or 500,000 acres, whereas now we've got something like 3 million hectares. It's a totally different situation. But Wyperfeld was a wonderful it was a gem as far as field naturalists were concerned.
The huge additions, the additions out to the west and the additions in the North Pine Plains, were all as a result of the Land Conservation Council recommendation. It was a remarkable period, the 60s and 70s. The 60s was when there was this awakening, and the 70s was when things started to happen. It was the era of environment. You had a premier in Hamer who was environmentally inclined. Everyone had a job. It was the boom time for the awakening of conservation. You'd agree with that, Leon, I think?
At the time that we were introduced to the bush, we were taught axemanship, and you used to go out and chop down trees. And so there's been a marked shift since those days. And I remember when I first heard the word ecology, and I thought, what is that word? Very few people knew anything about native trees. Most of the literature that we had came from England, and it was not applicable to Australian conditions. So I wrote the Little Tree Book in 1966. Wyperfeld was the first experience that I'd really had of the Mallee in looking at the plants of the Mallee. And so it was just the excitement of going there and just discovering things which were totally new to me. When I went there looking at the plants, it was mainly to look at Mallee plants, most of which are on the sands. You get an enormous diversity of plants on those sands. You don't get much along the watercourse itself.
Here you can look for wildflowers, or wander over the ridge where the white everlastings grow.
1974-75, the Committee of Management was replaced with an advisory committee, and that was primarily constituted of locals. And that was a very important phase because it meant that locals were having a much greater say. People who had a lot of local knowledge and a really strong interest in the park, and they provided very valuable advice. The funds were allocated to the Committee of Management by the National Parks Authority, later became the National Park Service, but the Committee of Management actually employed the ranger, which created some interesting situations.
Rudd was the person that made it, and everyone talked about him because he was, I'd say, about as famous as Wyperfeld itself. He had an extraordinary sense of humour, which was quite unique. I think it might be Pete humour. And he had numerous standoffs with Doc Smith, who was the boss of National Parks, Dr. Smith, Len Smith. And Len was very particular. Everything had to be done, perfectly. And bulldozing never is a perfect job. And of course he'd arrive up there and some of the bulldozing on the road was inferior, and rocks had been displaced, generally not up to standard. And I'll never get Rudd arguing with him and saying what wonderful precision and skill the operator had with the blade. And he said, Doc, he said he could have shaved a mouse while it slept.
He always likened something to something else. If you'd had a drought year and the kangaroos had been grazing, he'd say it's so bare you could flog a flea across it and never lose sight of it.
Another time we had this very stormy meeting and in the committee. I forget what it was about, but Hugh Wilson, I think, won the day, and Rudd was not allowed into the meetings, I think, or if he did, he was only called, and he was outside the Land Rover, and Hugh Wilson came out on his own, and Rudd said he came out like a goat out of a garden.
Well, Rudd was his own man, a lovely person, a fascinating person. He introduced the Mallee to a lot of people in such a way that they really got to like it. But one thing comes to mind when I look at a photo of Rudd with his hat on. In 1963, the National Parks Authority decided that all the rangers should be equipped with a uniform, including the hat. Now, all hell broke loose because people had different ideas of what the hat should be. And of course, Rudd was always used to a very different hat from that. And while other rangers throughout the state could just wear it for official occasions and then just forget about it, when you live in the Mallee, in the heat, and you've got fair skin like Rudd had, then you had to wear a hat all the time. So he just straight out refused and continued to wear his battered old hat, which was a totally different shape. When I look at the photo, I think, well, there's a battle won.
When you read the minutes of the Committee of Management, he was supposed to give them a report, and his reports are extraordinarily short, but you do get an idea of the character of the man from reading them. They're so brief, so to the point. He wasn't interested in bureaucratic language.
He was a strong character, but a very friendly one.
The ranger has spent years patrolling the twisting tracks, travelling hundreds of miles each week through some of the finest Mallee country you can see anywhere in Victoria.
When Rudd Campbell died, there was a fund started to create some memorial to him, and it raised quite a deal of money. There certainly wasn't anywhere near enough money to build an information centre, but everyone agreed that that would be a perfect outcome. So we in National Parks Service by then set about designing a building, taking into account the local sort of architecture. And we were successful in getting the necessary funds. And in 1981 it was opened as Rudd Campbell Information Centre. All in all, it's been a magnificent building, served a tremendous purpose as a meeting place, but an information centre most of all. It's something we're very proud of. In the early days, there might have been only a couple of thousand visitors a year. As the number of people increased, so the use of water became a major issue. And of course, in that heat, people were just having a cold shower anyway, so showers really started to run away with the amount of water. In the mid-60s, we got advice from the Public Works Department on how to build a catchment.
I remember going out to Patchy to look at finding the original ironclad catchments. It was really the blueprint for putting in that ironclad catchment at Wonga Hut. That was a very important innovation.
And with two very big tanks down in the bed of Lake Brimmen, certainly gave us a good supply of water, but what we did was cut out the showers, and that overcome the problem of water. So it's reasonably secure now.
In this dry and thirsty country, even the bees come, taking water back to cool their hives. And in the trees, others wait to take their turn.
I came in 1976 and canoed for a week, and that was fantastic. And lots of bird life, and it was difficult to navigate. It all looked much the same, and although I'd walked in the park before, it was completely different. And we canoed from Outlet Creek at the start of the park right through to Lake Bambrook.
Rudd always talked about the 1950s flood, and I suppose we sort of tacitly agreed that we would never see it again. And then in the 1970s it happened again, and that was just the most wonderful experience to see that water flowing up Outlet Creek and through the system. And although it didn't go as far as it used to 100 years ago, it was still absolutely fantastic to see it.
It was wonderful to come. That was why it took off so well, the Friends group, because the park was still in flood when we formed in 1976.
We were told it was a privilege to form a Friends group, and the public, they really didn't like the public involved in park sort of work in a park. It was to be, the public were to be kept separate. They were to be the visitors. We weren't to involve the rangers at all. They would supply us on the Saturday morning with about a dozen or so mattocks and guided us through. We parked our cars down in that sort of low bit there and pointed to this dune up here, and was covered in horehound, absolutely covered in horehound. Set to with your mattocks and dig out the horehound. That was the instruction, and that's what we did. And
you came back after that.
We came back, well, since 1976. It was hard work, and we just spent weekend, and only year after year, of course, weekend after weekend, and we burnt the, you were there when we burnt them.
We stacked them into huge piles, huge piles, and set fire to them.
We came back, and the whole dune that we'd done were covered again in little tiny horehound plants, because they had survived the summer. So we set due from the road here and started again. It was quite easy actually digging out these little ones. It wasn't the same huge job as the other. And we cleared that, and we kept on going and going and going and going. And we really continued that until, suddenly, I can't remember which year it was, there was a bit more communication with the Friends, and then they thought, well, perhaps they'd like to do something different, and
So we planted. We
started planting, and it was so much more positive, really. They realised then that the public were a force that they could use, and suddenly more Friends groups were encouraged.
There are many benefits, social and environmental benefits from having groups of people volunteering to do things in parks. It fills many needs, not least of which is the social need of people to be involved. At the same time, they're making a contribution to the environment.
Particularly of revegetation and interpretation in the park. The Friends have done a brilliant job. While they only have an outing there once a year, there's a lot of work goes into that weekend. The Friends really contribute an enormous amount that I suspect would not happen otherwise, because the rangers and the field staff really have a huge job on their hands to manage the various issues in the park. That takes up a massive amount of time, and it's hard to imagine them being able to apply the time, particularly to the interpretation side of it. So the Friends have done a marvellous job in actually setting out nature walks and putting in the signs associated with those nature walks, so that you go there now and you've got a whole choice of places you can walk and learn or drive. All those facilities which help you appreciate the park are a marvellous asset, and to a very large extent due to the Friends of Wyperfeld.
Eastern Lookout was the first planting, and to go up now and see those trees where there were no cypress pine until a fire had gone through and destroyed them, but now there's quite a profusion of them. Very satisfying. It's wonderful.
And similarly with our grey fergies. I think it's typical of what happens when people work in a particular area. They tend to develop a sense of ownership. They're really proud of what they've achieved, I'm sure, and we are. It's great to have interest groups out in the park having a good time and helping us out. It's tremendous.
I've come to Wyperfeld as part of the Harry Ferguson Tractor Club and to assist with the eradication of rabbits and the revegetation of the park. And we've been involved in fencing and burning and removing rabbit habitat and ripping burrows that have been fumigated. And it's been pretty successful. We were here last year, and apparently very few warrens have been reopened.
Last year, in a week, they ripped 600 warrens, a tremendous effort in itself. And what took them more than a week to cover last year, they're going to do in probably a short day this year. This has been a really, really good result.
They've had, I don't know, probably 40 members here this week, and 30 odd tractors, and we're just keen to help out.
Sit quietly for a moment and see the bush busy with its own natural life.
I've been heavily involved in footy, cricket, nearly all my life, and whilst I wouldn't swap any of that sort of recreation, but bird watching and going to places like Wyperfeld where you can just get out in the bush and totally relax is absolutely it's heaven on earth.
This old chap and my Uncle Pete, he was well into his 80s, and they'd come out on our outings and we'd find a shady spot and they'd sit in the shade, and we'd go and trudge off through the bush, and we'd come back and they'll have seen about the same amount as we had. They'd sat quietly and had a yarn, yeah.
It'd be a real achievement if you could see every bird that had been recorded in Wyperfeld. It'd be a real achievement. You can't go past a Mallee ringneck in its full glory, so to speak, or a mulga parrot, or a splendid wren.
Splendid wrens.
If you see a splendid wren, you'll be blown away. Probably the Major Mitchell's my favourite. Yeah. I mean, they're a magnificent bird.
And they're rare, I suppose.
And they're fairly rare.
Yeah.
When the top end of Wyperfeld, the Pine Plains area, became a national park, that was always known as the area where the Major Mitchells used to be. One of the great things with Wyperfeld is that it's not like rainforest where you have difficulty in seeing the birds. I mean, it's reasonably open in places. In fact, it's very open, so you get a really good look. Kept going back every year because you'll always see Major Mitchells in that one particular area, and it's a marvellous area to see them. And got to a stage of me thinking I'd like to get some photos, which I've been trying to get for several years. I don't know the exact details of how I was being watched. I know that there's some fairly sophisticated equipment being used, I think, from what I can gather. I was at a working bee in town, and I got a phone call. He said, I'm from the DSE. We're at your place now. He said, I want to talk to you. And when I got home, there was a vehicle at the front of the house, but there was also another vehicle down the side road. I got up to the house and they said who they were, and they just said, we want to talk to you over the smuggling of Major Mitchell eggs out of Wyperfeld. So it was a bit daunting at that stage, and they said, where do you want to talk? And I said, it doesn't worry me, you can come inside if you like. They said, those people out the back though, they're waiting, they've got a search warrant ready. If we find anything untoward here, that they've got the authority to come in and start searching the place. So anyway, we had quite a discussion for a while. I offered to show them all the photos that I had on my computer because I told them why I was there. I was just interested in birds full stop, and I was also very interested in taking photos. They accepted that. They didn't even want to look at my computer in the end, and they gave me a tick. They said, no problems, we're quite satisfied. Anyway, they knew my movements pretty well, and they'd known when I made phone calls, all that sort of thing. As they were leaving, just said to the chappie that I was talking to, I just said, oh, that's my wife Janice, and he just said, yeah, I know from the photos. But the good side is that at least they're, when I say at least, I mean they're really on the job, and that's the upside of it. One of the chappies eventually told me where there was another good place to go. Now I'm assuming that I'm not.
I think you're off the list. Next time we went back, you're a bit edgy.
But to do the wonderful work that bird photographers do is almost associated with an exceptionally good understanding of their nesting habits and all that sort of thing. And then I'm totally in awe of them. They spend so much time to get one photograph. Harold Tarr was an extraordinary person. He was very blunt. He was a builder and called a spade, a tough sort of, but a very good leader, and he was an excellent ornithologist, one of the best field ornithologists in Australia. And you might only see 2 or 3 of them, and he'd pick up the bird sounds of maybe 10 or 15 others. Just incredible.
Harold Tarr was on the Committee of Management, and later the Advisory Committee for Wyperfeld National Park, for a total of 36 years.
The early bird days intrigued me. They go up there and they shoot birds and they rob nests, and it just horrifies modern bird observers. But that was the times.
When I was looking at the track for the 9 Mile Square, I disturbed the male from the nest and went and had a look, and sure enough there's this magnificent nest of eggs, and it just happened that there was a family camped in the park at the time, and I asked if they would be interested, particularly the kids would be interested, and anyway took them out and showed them. The little girl was just blown away. Those sorts of experiences, which Rudd would have had all the time, are very special.
One that's probably most exciting to see would be the Mallee fowl.
We've been friends of Wyperfeld before we were doing any Mallee fowl sort of stuff. And one year in the newsletter, they said that they were looking for some people to volunteer to do some Mallee fowl monitoring. And then we just got fascinated, I think. The more we knew, the more we sort of learned about it, the more fascinating it all became. And it was just very exciting to be involved in such a large scientific program. Yeah, that was also sort of a motivational thing. It wasn't a bird watchery sort of thing.
Since 1999 I've been coming here to the Victorian Malleefowl Recovery Group's annual training weekend here at Wyperfeld National Park. I love this weekend. It's I've said, I upset my mum, sorry mum, but this is bigger than Christmas for me. I love getting together with a group of people who are really passionate and love what they do, and we share ideas and we talk about the possibilities of the future, and then after this we go out into the bush.
Talk about a wilderness type experience. We can find our own footprints from year to year in some places, and nobody else, not a single person has been where we have been. Nowadays, of course, we have GPSs, so it's considerably safer than it was when you were doing it walking with a compass and counting your footprints. Counting your steps to make sure you got your distances right, and then looking for something like this, like a needle in a haystack in the middle of nowhere. It's a bit of a challenge.
Before we got involved, they said you really need to know how many steps it takes to walk, say, 100 metres. So Anne and I went down to Landy Field, which is a running track in Geelong, and we got the 100 metres straight, and I think we walked that. I don't know how many times we walked up and down there and counted our steps. It's
one of the wonders of the world. They come out, they never see their parents again. They come out from the egg, they spend about half an hour in the shade, and then from then on they're an independent entity. Isn't that amazing?
And I think the other thing that attracts people to Malleefowl is how hard they work. They work their mounds for 11 months of a year.
So they have to open and shut the mounds all the time to maintain the temperature. So the story is that a male Malleefowl would shift about the order of a small trailer full of sand every day.
It scratches a living off the land, and I think the landholders all feel that way about it, that they all like the Malleefowl, and And this is a project where people like us come up from Melbourne and from Geelong, and we've got people here from Adelaide and even from Brisbane this year. And they're getting together with people from the bush, from local landholders and people from the towns. And it is a great sort of, it's a melting pot of people, and everybody gets together and feels great about the same thing. So that's a good thing. It's just wonderful. It's great. I love it.
The people are really friendly. They're sort of laid back, really different from the people you meet in the city, I find. And they're easy to talk to, and you can talk about just about any subject. It's probably counterintuitive to what you would think about people living on farms or, a long way from civilization, but they're, really good communicators, and you can talk to them really easy.
Also look at the plants and the...
Oh, yeah.
You take in the whole gambit of things. It's not just birds, but the birds are the birds are the reason you're there. But while you're there, you look at ants or lizards or snakes or whatever.
Flowers.
Yeah, flowers. Yeah.
I do like looking at the reptiles and that kind of stuff a bit more, like snakes and that kind of thing, and watching to see what the goannas are up to, and skinks. I also don't mind looking at scorpions. Now if I see a rock or something, I'll be like, oh, I wonder what's under that.
Started on birds, then on reptiles, and then I got into mammals, and mammals are my greatest love, but I just love anything in nature. The Mitchell's hopping mouse is pretty special. They're a vulnerable species now and fairly restricted. For a long time I used to fight in campaigns to try and save individual species, but then I realised it was far more important to save their habitat. And then you not only saved that species, but everything else that occupied that habitat. In more recent years, they've almost doubled the size of Wyperfeld. So there's now a massive area. The usual saying, I think, is bigger is better. The bigger your national park, the better it is for long-term conservation. It's just really an icon in Victoria. I had the privilege of serving on the advisory committee for 8 years. They've had some wonderful rangers over there for many, many years.
A lot of the rangers that have been there have been very, very dedicated. And a lot of the field staff, not just rangers, the construction maintenance staff, very dedicated people. A huge job on their hands to manage the various issues in the park, be they pest plants, pest animals, and visitor services. That takes up a massive amount of time. One has to applaud their dedication, because they put in a lot of extra time, a lot of hard work.
The ranger has seen many seasons change the face of the land. But the forests of black box along the track, the old red gums by the creek bed, and the heath country of sand and tea tree will always remain. For this is Wyperfeld, Victoria's largest national park.
It was always something new to see, and always something special. I will never forget the experience when Rudd took me to this absolutely massive red gum out in the middle of the desert almost. And Rudd, in his normal way, didn't tell me what he was taking me to see, but we just drove over this rise and down, and I just rose in the seat. I'd never seen a tree like it in my life, and I still haven't. It's the most beautiful tree I've ever seen. Now, that survived the 1959 fire. It was just the most magnificent tree. Unfortunately, the 1985 fire did hit it, but it struggled on.
See where fire has marked the land. But look closer and see how new life is pushing its way up from the burnt ground. Soon those sand dunes will be covered again with banksias and porcupine grass and low Mallee eucalypts.
We had a huge fire in the big desert in 1959, massive fire. And the Committee of Management and the National Parks Authority at the time decided that to try and prevent such a huge fire occurring again, and also to try to protect the unburnt part of the park, they would put in a network of fire trails, which would probably be 100 miles or more in total, and the final one to be constructed by me was the 9 Mile Square.
Righto, we'll just have a quick overview of where we're going today. We're heading down to the Wonga campground. We're going to go down the Meridian track till we hit the 9 Mile Square track, turn right, follow the 9 Mile Square track for 9 miles.
I would go up there in autumn and spend 2 or 3 weeks mapping out where the fire track might go. That meant just going out into the bush, usually just a compass and a can of fruit, and walk for the day. And if it was suitable, then I'd mark it with yellow tape, and then we'd come back and then construct the track using dozer and graders. The dozer driver would not have known where to go if I didn't have a stick with a yellow flag on the top up above the canopy of the trees. Because you're walking through Mallee that might be 10, might be 15 feet high. So I simply walked in front of the dozer holding up the stick, and he followed where I went through the bush. In doing so, I came across a lot of really interesting things, but particularly Malleefowl and Malleefowl mounds, and that was one of the great things. I identified quite a lot of Malleefowl mounds which were unknown, and then if there was one in the middle of where you were wanting to put the track, then you had to modify the track, and you couldn't just bend around it. You sometimes had to go well back and cross over into another valley. Some of the country you couldn't help feeling that you were the first to set foot on it. It was a great job.
There are walks along the sandy track, memories of pleasant camping places, sunlight and blue skies.
Walking in this country is difficult because a lot of the tracks are sandy, but it's the only way to see the wildlife.
Well, we had a really good day today, nice weather. I got to hold a lizard, a blue tongue, in my bare hands. Have you done that?
No.
And we followed emu footprints pretty much the whole way from where we started today until now. I enjoyed that.
Most major waterways would have been virtual highways. So people from, say, the Grampians would have followed most of the Wimmera River along, or even the Yarriambiack Creek along to get up north to Lake Wirrandrin for ceremonies, and vice versa. People up north probably would have followed those waterways down to, like Lake Lonsdale, which is another major ceremony area. Not only a river, but a pathway as well. From Lake Albocatcha north into Lake Wirrandrin, it's all part of the Wagaya language group, part of what we now call Wajibalik country. There were Aboriginal sites all the way along, mostly being the classical sort of canoe trees where bark was taken off the tree to make a canoe, or smaller bark removals for things like coolamans or shields. Most of the ones we saw were probably bark removals for shelters, I'd say, because you could see for a lot of them the axe marks going straight across each end. Some of them might not have been Aboriginal scarred trees, they might have been done by Europeans perhaps. Midden sites are really good that way. You can actually date how old they are if you can get down through the layers and find something that you can date, say any charcoal that's in the deposit. So they're pretty important that way. Basically the remains of people collecting mussel shells to get the meat out of them and eat them. We also came across stone tools and artefact scatters, which were usually in sand dune blowouts, where the vegetation and the sand has been blown out, uncovering like a layer of occupation evidence underneath, a lot of stone chips. We came across some larger stones, and we even thought we might have come across a fragment of an axe head as well. Different stone types come from different areas. I mean, you might have greenstone, which quite often would have been traded from around Lancefield, or all the way around southeastern Australia. There are other types of stone that are coastal in origin. They might have come from down south on the coast. It just goes to show the rich history of Aboriginal occupation around that area. There's just so many scarred trees and sandhills with, showing Aboriginal occupation. I think when you're do walks, I just realise there's so much more around. And that's the good thing about it. You're just actually out there and you're actually really opening yourself up, actually getting out and seeing, to me, what is the real world.
I love camping. I really love sleeping in a tent on the ground. And it's good here because that's the only way you can come and stay.
How long have we been coming up? 12, 14?
About 15, I think.
About 15.
In this spot.
Anyone that moves into this spot will be told,
you've got our spot.
You've got our spot. If they don't move, it's a most uncomfortable weekend for them.
And I like how it's so hot. That's what I like most. Yeah, and you can sit around in a tent. It's like a sauna. That's what I like.
A couple of times we slept out in the outside and we got a huge frost. And I remember Ian Morosky had frosted eyebrows and we were so cold. We camped out just with the sleeping bags. But one time we went up there and we had a mouse plague and we just had to go into the car because otherwise the mice got in your sleeping bag. It wasn't very nice.
When I was teaching at the university, we used to take students up there and have them out in the Mallee as the sun came up and the birds were calling. And you could just see the look on their faces at this vastness, the openness and the sun coming up and the birds. I don't think there would have been many students that wouldn't have been impressed by that.
It's just got to exist or else those sorts of birds will just disappear. Not only birds, but plants, animals, they'll just disappear. It's just great that they're set aside. I mean, it's magic.
Thank goodness there were people there that saw it as valuable and protected it and maintained it over the last 100 years. Otherwise it was in danger perhaps of
National Park at Wyperfeld in the northern part of Victoria is the only Mallee reservation in Australia and as such is of great importance. Its vegetation, stunted and drought-stricken as it is immensely interesting. It is the home of beautiful species of the cockatoo and parrot family. In 2 days, Dr. Leach identified 91 different varieties of birds. It is, however, not fenced, it is not patrolled, and it contains foxes and rabbits like all Mallee country. Many more and varied reservations are required. And then he went on to say, for our own sakes and for the good of all of those who will follow, let us do our best to preserve the wondrous features of the continent. To anyone possessed of imagination, the diversity of life and of form teaches us that we are looking at the outside of the problem, while the real significance is quite hidden from us. Even if, however, we cannot find the complete explanation of this wondrous diversity, we can at all events preserve these fascinating forms of life to stimulate our interests and those of generations to come.